Hunter, have you ever played a Nintendo device before?
I have. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And so what's your earliest memory with it?
Well, I guess two different things. One is that one of my good friends growing up had the original Nintendo home
Yeah.
console.
Nintendo
And
Entertainment System.
that's right. And I remember, going over to his place and playing, Donkey Kong.
Oh.
And that's the one I remember the most. And then some other games as well. But then I also was a child that, played video games in arcades, right? And so I remember, and this might be a little bit to the side, but playing, the original Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong, eventually Donkey Kong Jr., and some of those games as stand-up arcade games as well in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely a point when arcades were the primary method with which people interacted with video games, right? That was
Right.
People would go to a centralized location. There would be these, sort of really large consoles of all variety of different kinds of things. Some of them were Nintendo, although Nintendo, from my research, was never hugely profitable in that market. There was another company that would ultimately become one of their big competitors, which is Sega.
Okay.
They had a much higher presence in arcades, and I think that ultimately brought about sort of their downfall a little bit as well, as that market sort of contracted. But you did mention one particular video game, the Donkey Kong series of video games.
Yep.
That you might have played originally. And we are absolutely going to talk about Donkey Kong, in addition to Mario, in addition to Zelda, in addition to a lot of Nintendo's overwhelmingly powerful properties today. If you haven't picked up on it yet, listener, today we are, I mean, obviously you did, you probably read the title. Today's episode is the geography of Nintendo, or I should say geography is Nintendo. And I think when I was sort of pulling together this episode in the beginning, one of the first things I wanted to address was this idea of a Nintendo, which is there's sort of like a common refrain, sort of, maybe from parents, that everything is a Nintendo if it's a video game device.
They had that kind of market share early on, kind of.
They had that kind of market share, right? So I kind of wanted to talk about, so basically, like, what is quote unquote a Nintendo and what is it not? So that's very intentional phrasing of the question, right? So basically, Nintendo, the name, jumping ahead of myself here. Basically, a Nintendo is, inside that phrasing, is used as sort of any sort of video game device. Today, we're talking about very specifically Nintendo devices. So that would be your Nintendo Entertainment System that you just spoke about, Hunter. I'll talk about your Super Nintendo Entertainment device. It's your Nintendo 64, your Nintendo GameCube, your Nintendo Wii. That's a very popular system that a lot of people listening to this probably very well aware of.
Mm-hmm.
All the way up to today, which would be your Nintendo Switch, right? What it's not really going to cover is the, PlayStations, your Xboxes, your Segas, your, all manners. There's a dozen different video game devices floating out there.
Some of those will come up a little in the conversation, but
they will come up. Yes, yeah. We're not sitting here in a silo. So these companies will come up, but we're just to get at this question a little bit. We're talking very specifically about Nintendo devices. So when we mention a Nintendo device, we're going to be talking about a Nintendo device. If I'm going to be talking about a PlayStation, for example, I will call it a PlayStation. I don't think this is as common anymore. Although I do know at a certain point, it was very common for everything to just be referred to as a Nintendo.
Like Coke,
Like Coke. Yeah. Like Coke or Kleenex or, what have you.
Yeah.
And so Nintendo, the name, just to get at this, sort of the beginning, probably doesn't mean what you think it means, because there's, if you Google this, there's some quotes out there that says that it means something to the degree of, quote unquote, leave luck to heaven, or quote unquote, to leave one's fortune in the hands of fate. But that actually doesn't really appear to be true. So, so this goes back to, a long time ago, which we'll get to in a little bit. But essentially in Japan, Nintendo's official logo still uses the kanji characters. And so it's important to understand sort of what they sort of maybe originally meant to the company's founder, who we'll get to in a little bit. According to the book, The History of Nintendo, which was published in 2012, but is otherwise a very, very hard book to find. It's not available digitally anywhere. In fact, the only copy I could find was almost $100 on Amazon. It's just a
It's
paperback.
itself becomes a collector's item because it's associated with the brand.
But according to this book, its actual name is kind of a mystery. So the origins of its name. So the closest that they could sort of find was that it probably stems from a time when Nintendo was making a series of gambling playing cards under the name of Tengu. But we really don't know. And Tengu, I think, has some connotations towards gambling. So Ninten has the 3 letters in there as well.
Oh, I see.
I think Nin means something in kanji and Do means something in kanji. Again, we don't know. And even Hiroshi Yamauchi, who is related to the founder, I think it's great grandson or something like that, has admitted that he doesn't even know the true meaning of the company's name. So, what is a Nintendo and what does Nintendo mean? Just getting at these things very early on so that we sort of level set here. But then also let's talk about a little bit about why we're talking about Nintendo at all. Well, I think, just like our episode on Lego or, any episode that we do that's broadly based around a company, Nintendo is a global brand. They have had an immense impact on the world with their, technology, their entertainment, and probably mostly these days, their intellectual property. So they've had a huge impact in exporting sort of Japanese culture to the world through a lot of these properties. And Nintendo owns some of the largest media properties in the world, including Mario, who we'll talk quite a bit about, but maybe also less obvious properties such as Pokemon, which is a huge, huge media franchise.
Absolutely it is. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that because I think Pokemon is probably going to surprise a lot of listeners here about how dominant it is in terms of media franchises. More to that point, we're also talking about Nintendo today because they're just kind of having a monster year. If you're not fully up to date on sort of what Nintendo's up to these days, the company most recently released a new Zelda video game that has gone on to sort of smash video game sales records globally and made a lot of news and around the world. It's also had the Mario Brothers movie come out earlier this year, which has grossed over $1 billion internationally at the box office.
Wow.
So I think it's the only $1 billion movie so far this year. So that sort of shows the weight of maybe some of the IP that Nintendo owns. Nintendo also has opened Nintendo branded theme parks in both Japan and LA and soon in Orlando. And so
wow. Okay.
They are expanding in a, dare I say, very Disney-esque manner. No.
Yeah. I mean, the theme park thing, right? I mean, there were theme parks before Disney, and this is another future episode, right? The theme park episode.
Absolutely.
But Disney made it something else, it seems like.
Well, yeah. I mean, Disney really pioneered the idea that a theme park can really be less about sort of an abstract ride and more about living in another world, so to say, right? Now you're going to go and live in a Nintendo world or at least experience a Nintendo world for a day. I didn't do too much research on the actual experience within these Nintendo worlds. I think they're called Super Nintendo Land, maybe.
We'll have to do a little research field work, so to speak.
Yeah, I know, right? But I have seen some pictures, and I did read a couple of reviews here and there, and apparently they're really dynamic. They're really interesting. If you're obviously a fan of Mario, I think you get a lot out of visiting one of these theme park locations in a similar manner as I think I've heard similar things about the Harry Potter world in Orlando. It's just very dynamic, and you really do feel enmeshed in it a little bit. Finally, we're talking about Nintendo just because it has kind of a unique geography to it. And we've already kind of alluded to this with their theme parks and sort of their global brands and their IP. But it also has something, within the video game sphere as well. Nintendo's geography, it really boils down to 3 major markets, which is Japan, the United States and Canada, and Europe. And we're going to find that this kind of tracks with the video game industry at large. And so there's a reason why these are sort of the 3 main markets, and there's also reasons why they haven't really grown beyond these 3 major markets. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Even places such as Australia, which we would think would be, it's an Anglo sort of country, in a lot of ways very similar to places like the United States and Canada. They don't appear to have gravitated towards video game consoles such as the Nintendo in the same way. And so
Interesting.
there's some reasons for that we're going to sort of parse out. And so let's move on to some terminology. We're talking about video games. We're talking about Nintendo. We already covered what a Nintendo is, but because we're going to be talking about video games, and you, listener, probably, and maybe even you, Hunter, probably aren't a huge gamer. Some terms might fly completely over your head. So let's talk a little bit about that right now. So high level, what a video game is. Basically, it's just any interactive media entertainment that's played on a digital device. And so this applies to any games played on a Nintendo device, but also phones, computers, PlayStations, Xboxes. You've probably heard some of these terms before. Obviously, a video game would not be a board game or a card game. And that latter part will be very important because that's kind of where some of our history is going to start.
Nice.
Yeah. There's this idea of a console, which is a device that is sort of tailor-made for video games. That doesn't mean that's all it does, but that's it. That's its express purpose. That's why it's made. And so
its main function.
Kind of be, that's its function, right? This can kind of be broken out into two types. There's the home console, which is traditionally a device that would hook up to your TV, allowing for you to play it in, say, the living room. So like the original Nintendo Entertainment System, Hunter, that you played would be a home console. The PlayStation 2, the Xbox, etc. Then there's also handheld consoles, and this would be a device that's entirely self-contained. So screen, audio, everything. And it's meant to be played really anywhere you want it, but it comes with certain limitations, right? So batteries, worse screen, worse graphics, all that kind of stuff. And this would be your Game Boys, for example, a very popular Nintendo device that came out in sort of the late 80s or early 90s. And of course, there are smartphones and computers that can run video games, right? Basically anything that's digital can run a video game, even an old Texas Instrument calculator. But these would not be considered consoles because, like I said, they are not dedicated video game devices. Rather,
it's not their primary function.
It's not their primary function, right? Their primary intent is to do something else. I think in the case of a smartphone, it's primarily for communicating, right? Whether that's through social media or actually taking a phone call every now and then. Just moving along,
less and less popular as using it as a phone, but regardless, it's number. And some people might use it for gaming more than anything, but technically speaking, it's a communication.
Oh, we'll talk about that a little bit. Yeah. And so just to run through some other terms just really quick. So there's a cartridge. We'll talk about sort of cartridges. These are sort of the common name for what many early video games were played on. So if you think of that old Nintendo game, Donkey Kong, Hunter, that you put into your friend's Nintendo device, it's sort of this plasticky thing, plastic gray shell. That's a cartridge, has some circuit boards in it. This would be different from, say, a CD, which comes into play in video games down the road. There's a couple other things just to very highly mention. There's this acronym DLC, stands for downloadable content. So this is additional content that comes out afterwards. It kind of plays into the economics of sort of how the video game industry has evolved. Really, it's you can extend the life of a video game well into the future, as well as microtransactions, which would be even smaller fees. And this would be something that's pretty common within modern day apps today on your phone, right? You download a weather app and it's, purchase the radar, aspect of it for 99 cents, that kind of thing. So that's also attached to video games. I think those terms will get us through this episode. There are a lot of terms I found within the video game sort of industry that get really into the weeds, and I just don't think we're really going to need them. If we do come across them, then I think maybe we'll try and define them at the moment.
We'll tackle those as we come.
Yeah. Okay. With all that out of the way, let's get to Nintendo itself, starting with our history and starting really with the birth of Nintendo. So, Hunter, I'm going to ask you this question. How old do you think Nintendo is?
I don't know exactly how old it is, but I do know that it's older than video games. And I know this because I had a student in one of my classes a number of years ago who wrote a paper about Nintendo, and I learned about the history that being over 100 years old. As a matter of fact, I believe you were that student who wrote that paper.
That's true. That's true. A little bit of geography is everything history trivia here. I was at one point a student in a globalization class that Hunter was leading, and we had to tackle a certain company, and I chose Nintendo because it was a fascinating company to talk about in terms of globalization. And this is also when I had learned that Nintendo was far older than I thought. I think most people would think, oh, Nintendo, they're a video game company. Maybe my earliest memories of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was their first sort of, major video game system.
That was the 80s, right?
It was the 80s, right? And so they would assume like, oh, this was a small company that sort of started up in the 80s and sort of, caught wind of this, industry that was growing. And that's sort of what took them. That's not true. The reality is that Nintendo was actually founded as the actual name of the company was Nintendo Karuta. And I'm very likely going to be mispronouncing some Japanese words here. So I do apologize if I do. It's not intentional. But Nintendo Karuta on September 23rd, 1889. And so that's an old company.
That's older than Lego, for God's sake.
It's older than Lego. We just covered in our last week's episode the Titanic. It's older than the Titanic.
That's right. That's right.
And it was founded by a man named Fusajiro Yamauchi in Kyoto, Japan. Yamauchi is a very important name to Nintendo, as some member of his family had been in control of the company up until pretty recently. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But just know that Yamauchi and Nintendo kind of go hand in hand. There is a photo out there from Nintendo's original headquarters on Wikipedia that actually has their name on the building. So you can kind of see that. It appears to be dated 1889, but I actually can't trace it to that date specifically. But it is very clearly a very old photo. It's kind of cool to see the very humble beginnings. Obviously, Nintendo today, it has very large campuses, like any sort of mega company does. But when Nintendo was originally created, obviously it wasn't making video games. Video games in 1889 didn't exist. So instead, what it was making, it was making a game, playing card game called Hanafuda, which was a popular game in Japan. I'm not super familiar with Hanafuda cards. It doesn't appear to be super popular today. And obviously this would not be the same kind of cards as sort of your, ace of spades, club of spades, sort of the normal, what we would perceive as the normal deck of cards today. And according to Nintendo, the business's first Western style card deck was put on market in 1902. So they did try and expand globally pretty shortly relative after their founding. Although, according to my research, this would ultimately be postponed until 1907 due to the Russian-Japanese War. And so this comes from Nintendo themselves. I think the point to make here is that Nintendo is much older than most people realize. Their two largest sort of direct competitors today, which would be Sony and Microsoft, who make the PlayStation and Xbox respectively, were both founded decades later in sort of the middle of the 1900s. I think Sony is closer to 1950 and Microsoft is closer to 1970.
Very different history.
But very different history, right? Now, that said, their current incarnation as a video game company is obviously much newer. And I think, it's always worth sort of debating, as we go track through history, sort of, whether a company is truly whole throughout its full existence, or does it go through some pretty fundamental shifts that ultimately change it and create a new business? And I think you could make that argument with Nintendo. Now, at this point, because, in 1889, between 1889 and sort of the middle of the 1900s, Nintendo doesn't seem to do all that much. They sort of are pretty localized. They maybe try and do some card stuff outside of Japan, but generally they don't seem to expand or do very much. We're going to go ahead and just kind of jump ahead a few decades, and that will happen right after this ad break.
So we'll be right back.
And we're back. We're talking about Geography is Nintendo, the video game company that is very quickly becoming not just a video game company today. They've expanded globally, and now they are branching out into other markets. We just ran through sort of the birth of Nintendo, but we're still sort of figuring out the history, because obviously, if you listen to the first part, they were founded in 1889 in Japan. Today, this is as a playing card company. Today, this is a much different Nintendo than what started in 1889. So how did they get from that to here? So let's figure that out. So much of Nintendo's early history is a little nebulous from what I can find. So the book I mentioned earlier might have more detailed information, but I can only kind of find snippets from it. A lot of it comes from sort of, I guess Google Books has, scanned all of the pages of the book, but I can't find the book in its full form. So what I could find, though, was that by 1929, Nintendo was the largest playing card company in Japan, but didn't actually find all that much success from outside of the country. So we're still talking, in terms of geography, the Nintendo is still very much a Japanese-oriented company. And during World War II, of course, the company would not have much interaction with the global market, as a lot of companies didn't at the time. It was, it was a very dangerous time to try and do anything, right? So shipping things across the ocean was pretty dangerous. But also being a Japanese company, being at war with, much of Europe and the United States and Canada, a lot of these markets, as well as China, does not make a conducive global market. So Nintendo very much sort of hanging out in Japan at the time. But then in 1951, the company's president was a man named Sekiro Kaneda, also known as Sekiro Yamauchi. Apparently, he married into the family and would take the name himself. He would be the person who leads Nintendo through much of this sort of first half of the 19th century. But he would become ill, and the company would then pass to a man named Hiroshi Yamauchi. It's the grandson of the original founder, or great-grandson, I think. And this would be the person that, if you remember earlier when we were talking about the name of Nintendo, he's the one who said that even he doesn't know where the name truly came from.
That's right.
But Hiroshi would maintain as the president of Nintendo from about 1951 all the way until 2002. And so this is sort of this person really does span the time of Nintendo's life that would really transition it from a playing card company to being the global video game brand it is today and holder of so many valuable IPs. So he sort of led it. He would retire in 2002, ultimately transfer sort of the company over to, which is a publicly traded company, by the way, to a man named Satoru Iwata. And so that would be the first sort of person who was not of the Yamauchi clan to actually lead Nintendo over 100 years after its founding.
I was going to ask that question, that this is a publicly traded company, which makes it different from Lego, which is a family company and is
exactly,
there aren't shareholders. It's a family that owns it. But this is a different situation.
Yeah. So it's a publicly traded company. So anybody can buy stocks. They're listed in the Nikkei, I believe, in Japan, Tokyo Stock Exchange. Although I did dig a little bit into who owns most of their shares, and basically the largest pension sort of system in Japan owns a large chunk of Nintendo.
Interesting. Okay.
So it's really Japan as the pension system kind of controls a lot of sort of the direction of Nintendo just by having an overwhelming amount of shares in the company. And I think a lot of pride gets wrapped up into it. Nintendo is, if nothing else, and we're going to talk a lot about this later, but if nothing else, is a very Japanese company, and a lot of their systems and processes and even sort of their cultural ideals. This little side note also about Hiroshi Yamauchi, he would go on kind of with Nintendo purchase the Seattle Mariners, who they would own the Mariners for quite a long time, a number of decades. I think they only recently sold the team to another investor sort of person. I'm not sure who that is, but I think there was always a fun fact that I had heard before I even did any sort of research on Nintendo, that Nintendo owns the Seattle Mariners, which I always thought was funny.
Another nice Pacific Northwest tie-in for the podcast.
There's always got to be one, right? It always comes back to the Pacific Northwest in my head. Just to keep us moving, in 1953, Nintendo would become the first company to succeed in mass producing plastic playing cards in Japan. And so again, if you're interested in sort of plastics, we have a couple of really great episodes on that. And here's sort of Nintendo becoming, one of the very first companies within Japan to actually mass produce a plastic, for lack of a better word, toy, right? Something that's an entertainment device, and sort of, helping to propel that industry along a little bit. So
at the very time that the plastic industry really starts to to develop and become something that can be used in common objects that are sold on a
Right.
regular basis.
And this carries on, right? As we go through the years, and they start producing more actual toys and then video games, and then even to this day, Nintendo creates a lot of devices that are primarily plastic oriented. And so this kind of all tracks back to this, this period in 1953. It looks like that Nintendo kind of becomes a manufacturer, a plastics manufacturer, by way of their sort of what they're selling and creating.
Mm-hmm.
According to my research in 1956, or at least some research that I could find, Hiroshi would take a trip to the U.S. to meet with the United States Playing Card Company. At the time, that would be the biggest card company in the world. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that I have not been able to independently verify this information. It pops up here and there, but nothing that I would say is definitive. That said, apparently after Hiroshi visits the U.S. Playing Card Company and seeing the sheer scale and size of their operations, he sort of realized that Nintendo would never really be able to compete with this company. And that's sort of what started this exploration of other business ventures outside of sort of these Hanafuda cards, or at the time, exploring maybe creating playing cards for the world. So again, I can't verify this information. That said, it does appear to track with a change in what Nintendo sees as their future. So it is right around this time that you do see a fundamental shift that Hiroshi sort of leads the company into something maybe a little bit different in terms of recreation devices. So during the early 1960s, Nintendo would explore a wide range of different items to sell as they try and break free from the playing card business. Interestingly, they would, at a very short period of time, they would become a food company creating an instant rice sort of packaged product, sort of in the same vein as the instant noodles or Top Ramen that we see on our store shelves today. Very interesting trajectory. Had that taken off, it might have been a very different Nintendo today.
That's
right. They would also create and try to sell a vacuum cleaner called the Chiratori, which I did find a picture of. It looks like kind of a weird remote controlled vacuum cleaner. Not honestly, it doesn't look all that different from a Roomba, although obviously a lot clunkier.
Yeah, they got the early jump on the Roomba, but then they didn't capitalize on it.
Well, and it failed. So it wasn't
because there was no cat videos at the time, right? That's what really took for the Roomba to take off, I think.
Exactly, that's what it took. And obviously, Roomba, came out at a time when there was a little bit more of an automation in the process. I think, again, this is the 60s. Remote controls in general were pretty rudimentary. It's using sort of radio waves to control things. It probably wasn't all that impressive. It was probably easier to just pick up your old vacuum and, go to town.
That's right.
So all of these businesses would ultimately fail, forcing Nintendo back into the playing card business, where they would sort of languish for a little while longer. However, in 1965, Nintendo would hire a man to help repair their assembly line machinery that made their playing cards. So this was a mechanical engineer. His name was Gunpei Yokoi, I think. And he would be the first person, or he would be the person who would ultimately get Nintendo out of playing cards and into video games. And so this guy has sort of an interesting history, and sort of one of those moments, as happens with a lot of companies, there seems to be a certain person or idea that sort of starts off as something very small or not intentional, and then that sort of spirals into what they become.
Moves in a different direction.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. It's, if we go back to our Lego episode, we talked a lot about how, Lego was a sort of carpentry company, and eventually they were making sort of wooden toys. But ultimately they would sort of try and figure out, how to break out of this. And they would approach this other company, was a Kitty Craft, in order to take this idea of sort of building blocks and run with that. Right.
And once again, plastic. Yep.
Yeah. And once again, plastic. So this is kind of Nintendo's moment with this guy, right? Gunpei Yokoi. And so this process wouldn't happen overnight. Video games at this point were very crude, right? So we're talking about the 60s. For my research, the earliest video game was something called Tennis for Two, which was created in 1958. And I did see a picture of it. It looks kind of like one of those old radar devices, with like the spiraling thing. It goes doo,
Right.
I don't know exactly what it sounds like, but it just looks exactly like that. Pong, which I think is probably more closely associated as the first video game, wasn't developed until 1972. So we're still in this period of time where, even though this person here who would ultimately go on to help Nintendo get out of this industry and into sort of interactive entertainment, we're still in this period of time where things are really crude. So,
and most people had black and white televisions at the time,
or I don't even at this point, maybe most people don't even have televisions at all.
But if they have them,
but if they have
not
one,
color,
yeah. If they have one, it's not color. It's it's probably very small. I think this is the ones that are probably mostly associated with scares of like radiation, not sitting too close to the TVs and all that kind of stuff. However, mythologized that might be. But getting back to Yokoi, so in 1966, Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, had noticed that he was sort of making something that would be like an extending arm-shaped toy in one of Nintendo's factories. Again, he's a mechanical engineer. He was hired to repair some of these machinery. However, obviously, he has the knowledge and sort of the desire to make things, make mechanical things specifically. And so Yokoi had made one of these sort of extending arm-shaped sort of toys, sort of a rough draft of one, just for fun, sort of, just as being a young person, sort of wanting to experiment and having all this machinery around him. And seeing its ingeniousness of this toy, Yamauchi ordered Yokoi to develop it as a proper product for really the Christmas rush, the holiday rush, and released it as the Ultra Hand. And so this would become one of Nintendo's earliest toy blockbusters, selling over 100,000 units. This was really the first thing outside of playing cards that alluded to any sort of successful Nintendo. And again, if we track back to when Yokoi was hired and sort of what he was hired to do, had he not been hired, had they opted to go with somebody else, we could very well be looking at a very different Nintendo today.
Mm-hmm.
Yokoi would ultimately after this sort of item was a sort of a blockbuster item, Yamauchi would pull him off of the assembly line work and really into product development. And so Yokoi would go on to create the first dedicated video game device at Nintendo. It's something called the Game & Watch in 1980. And of course, Yokoi made and developed other interactive toys, but this would mark sort of the fundamental shift of Nintendo as a toy company and into a video game company. And that's this Game & Watch system.
So late 70s. It's
1980 is when Game & Watch would come out, but yeah, he's developing this stuff in the 70s. So he's sort of tinkering with stuff. And they're making other toys, right? And Yokoi is making other toys as well, right? During the 70s. They're doing other different things. They're usually pretty interactive. Yokoi sort of did spearhead sort of the creation of the Game & Watch system, which I don't think a lot of people know of. I think typically if somebody even is sort of maybe well versed in sort of the video game industry or likes Nintendo a lot, maybe they associate the Nintendo Entertainment System that you talked about, at the beginning of this episode, Hunter, as the first Nintendo device. But that's actually not true. And it's this Game & Watch device, which I'm not sure how familiar people are with this kind of device, but if you're familiar with this old company called Tiger Electronics, back in the 90s, they made these sort of like interactive football game where it's really just sort of like a little digital device that would have like 3 movements on screen, very crude screen. It's just black and white. You could maybe control left or right, and maybe you could see some other crude things coming at you. Very kind of hard to play. This is kind of the level of interactive video game we're talking about. This
is very much a precursor to kind of small portable games that are popular now.
And so Nintendo really started out as a handheld video game company in terms of the video game industry, right? They didn't start out as a home console company, which again, I think a lot of people gravitate towards sort of the bigger sort of home console, the things that you plug into your TVs. Nintendo didn't start there. They started creating something that's portable and, something that people can take around, and that's persists throughout their legacy today.
This sort of, in a way, becomes the Game Boy eventually, or I don't know if it's
absolutely does,
but yeah, that's kind of the trajectory.
It absolutely eventually feeds into becoming the Game Boy. Yeah. So the technology sort of spirals up from there. So this would also be when Nintendo starts to become more of a global company rather than just a Japanese toy company. And so everything we sort of talked about, and, this is a geography podcast. We try and talk a lot about sort of the impact on the world and the spatialness of everything. the history up until this point, aside from some, few points where, Nintendo explores, selling abroad or something like that, they've really just been a Japanese company at this point. So this is sort of that inflection point where it's, they hit on some success. Now they have these devices and it's about to go global. So the first version of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was called the Famicom in Japan, was launched in 1983 in Japan. The system would later release in North America in 1985, and it was rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System. And so if you look up old research, or what have you in Japan on this device, it'll always be called the Famicom. And that would extend into the next iteration of the device, which would be the Super Famicom or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System here in the US. It's kind of worth highlighting here that at this point, Nintendo kind of went all in on video games during a time when this industry was collapsing. So I'm not sure how familiar you are, Hunter, with this company called Atari. Do you know them?
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with Atari.
So Atari, if you're not familiar, they are, or I should say were, an American video game console company. And they made a lot of sort of quick and cheap games on a device called the Atari 2600.
At the time, it was just called the Atari, I think.
Just called the Atari.
I think it came out before the Nintendo game did. Because I had another friend. Mm-hmm. Was it before, or was it the same time?
It was before. Yeah. The Atari was.
I had another friend who had the Atari, and the graphics were pretty 8-bit fundamental, but you could play it at home, and it was pretty entertaining. And there were lots of different games. And then the Nintendo came out, and the graphics were much better.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so I had to live vicariously through my friends. I had to go to their house to play these things. I'm still racking my brains now. I must not have asked enough or something like that to get one of these, but yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah. So I have here in my notes. So the home video game revenues peaked at around $3.2 billion globally in 1983.
Wow.
And so this would be right when the Nintendo Entertainment System was launching in Japan. It would not come to North America for a couple more years. But by 1985, when the Nintendo would come to the US, that revenue had fallen to around $100 million. So it cratered. The industry was in sort of a free fall at this point. Atari.
That's so interesting, because I don't remember it. I don't remember that being the case. I just remember the games being really popular. I didn't realize there was such a decrease. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from my research, much of this is attributed to Atari, who made a lot of sort of these quick and cheap games that kind of forced a saturation effect.
Yeah.
And basically, there's this really infamous story behind this one specific Atari game. It was called E.T. and it was based off of this.
I remember the game even. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this was kind of I think this is kind of thought of as the catalyst for the crash, in that I think I had read that Atari had created more video game sort of cartridges for the Atari than they had sold Atari consoles. But it was coming off the backs of this immensely popular movie. Apparently they thought it was, a home run. There was absolutely nothing that could crash it.
They anticipated it would drive sales of the console itself, probably.
Probably, exactly. Apparently the video game was so bad that the company ended up dumping the entire unsold stock in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And this
buried it in the ground, right?
They buried it in the ground. This was originally thought to be more of a myth, but I guess a recent documentary actually uncovered some of this stash of ET cartridges in there. The point here to make is that, as Nintendo is expanding into North America and sort of launching in Japan as this video game company, it kind of went all in on this after sort of playing around with the Game & Watch. A lot of people kind of expected it to be dead on arrival. It was just not something that a lot of people thought was a growing industry at the time. But to your point, Hunter, Nintendo brought a new level of technology and quality to its video games, mostly spearheaded by a single man named Shigeru Miyamoto. Have you ever heard of this person, Hunter?
This is not a familiar name to me, no.
So if you're in the video game industry, or maybe if you're just a really passionate fan of video games, I think this is a pretty common name.
Okay.
Miyamoto is really largely credited with saving Nintendo by way of his video game creation. So Gunpei Yokoi created a lot of the technology around this early stuff, but it's really Miyamoto who goes on to create a lot of the iconic characters for Nintendo. And so he's largely credited for creating Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, Star Fox, Pikmin, some lesser known ones, F-Zero, Nintendogs, and has helped guide many more projects. So I'm guessing of all those characters I listed, I know you know one, but I'm guessing there's at least two more that you know.
Yeah, I know Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong. You know,
Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't get to have these games when I was growing up, but I went to the arcade to play games. But also at some point in college, I made the conscious decision to kind of not get into video games because I figured I would never graduate if I were playing games all the time. And, you know, maybe I missed an opportunity to go into a different career because now I'm in the academy when I could be doing something else. But yeah, so some of those names are familiar to me because you can't escape them.
Right, exactly. And I think, having, Hunter, having you here who, maybe you're not as, you're not as knowledgeable about this industry actually kind of helps sell the point a little bit. And that who Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong are just by pure osmosis of the media fueled empire that's been built
Zelda,
up around
I've never played. I mean, I've played Mario games and Donkey Kong games. Zelda, I've never played, but I'm certainly familiar with the name.
Yeah, it's a huge mammoth property for Nintendo. So there are very, very few people associated with Nintendo in the same way as Miyamoto is today. In fact, I would argue that even the founder and the name Yamauchi is not as associated with Nintendo in the same way that Miyamoto is. He is still alive today. He still works at Nintendo, although he is getting older. But he has had just an incredible impact on the company. And again, without this hire by a single person, it's you kind of start to struggle to see Nintendo in the same way, just based on sort of some of these characters that are so iconic today. Of course, with quality games and interesting characters and sort of this new technology, this kind of really did skyrocket Nintendo to a level of success it had never seen before. And it kind of is seen as the sole reason for why the video game industry was able to rebound after its almost near fatal collapse. And so the Nintendo Entertainment System, the one that you played, Hunter, would go on to sell over 60 million units worldwide. Just some figures here, about 20 million of them are from Japan. 34 million were sold within the United States. So clearly a huge market for Nintendo from the very earliest days as a video game company. 8 million are from Europe broadly. I don't have specific country figures for that. But Nintendo didn't sell in any other regions during this time. And this now follows a geographic trend that we still see in the video games industry at large. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Nintendo would continue to have a level of success that is pretty impressive, though most of its success would come at the beginning and then now today. And so, during with the release of additional consoles and handheld consoles by competitors, first in Sega and then Sony and then Microsoft, Nintendo has had some rough times.
There was also something called Intellivision. You've ever heard of Intellivision?
So there was Intellivisions. I unearthed a treasure trove of video game consoles I had never heard of.
Yeah, and that one was maybe not as popular as the others, but was on the scene, I felt like.
Yeah, so there was Intellivision. There was something called, I think, 3DO. There was something that we're going to talk about, and that's really fun. It's going to be our bonus episode called the Philips CDI.
Okay.
I think there's a lot more video game devices out there than people might think. Atari even makes a comeback in the 90s and sells something called the Atari Jaguar as a new sort of device. It doesn't do super well. I think made clear by the fact that there's no more Atari devices today.
That's right. It's amazing to think about because when they came out, it was enormous and they had a lot of ad presence, but they didn't keep up with the graphics. I think that I don't know if that's actually one of the reasons, but in my mind, that would probably be one of the reasons.
From what I've heard, it really was the quality, right? So people would buy these games, which were pretty expensive back then,
Yep.
These were not small purchases, and you have to buy the whole system as well, right? We're talking about hundreds of dollars of equipment in the 1980s. That would be a lot more today.
That's right.
And I think it got to a point where so many of these games were just so quickly and cheaply made that people are just like, well, what am I buying? And they sort of lost
Pac-Man
trust.
came out, and it was so rudimentary compared to the stand-up arcade game that you would go pay a quarter for. I mean, the Pac-Man, the mouth would just be always in the same direction. It wouldn't even go up or anything like that.
That's so funny. So apparently during some of these rough times, Microsoft apparently floated an offer to purchase Nintendo in the late 1990s. Nintendo was having a little bit of a lull. It has their most recent system, the Nintendo 64, wasn't doing so hot. I think it ultimately sold far fewer than the Nintendo Entertainment System. And then Microsoft apparently wanting to get into the video games industry did float an offer, but apparently from what I could read, they were literally laughed out of the meeting by Nintendo executives. So I think, again, going back to just how culturally Japanese Nintendo is and how proud they are of being an independent Japanese company, I think the likelihood of Nintendo ever selling to another company is probably slim to none. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the company goes out of business first, although I think at that point, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. I have here in my notes that the Nintendo 64 and Nintendo GameCube home consoles, which would come out in succession right after each other, so Nintendo 64 and then the GameCube, would sell fewer units combined than the original Nintendo. So they're definitely slumping a little bit. A couple other notable failures would be the company's Virtual Boy console, which was kind of this weird face mask thing. It's kind of maybe like looks like an early version of what VR headsets look like today. But it's much older, and the technology was obviously just not quite there yet. Figures are basically impossible to come by for how well this thing sold, but apparently it was such a colossal failure that Nintendo has almost entirely scrubbed the device from their own records. They don't make mention of it. You can find records on some of their less successful consoles like the GameCube and the Nintendo 64. They do not apparently like to talk about the Virtual Boy.
No, they're going to let that one go.
Yeah, from what I can tell, it sold fewer than 1 million units globally. The Wii U, which is a more recent console and the successor to the incredibly popular Wii home console, was also a pretty colossal flop. It only sold about 10% of the Wii's total sales. So the Wii U was, again, a bit of a low point. So this brings us up to just about today. But first, before we get to today, and maybe the video games industry at large, and maybe some of the geography of this, let's do a quick ad break.
We will be right back.
And we're back talking about the geography of Nintendo and maybe kind of actually, the video games industry at large. So we just covered a lot of history, sort of brought us from sort of Nintendo's relatively humble beginnings as a playing card company all the way up to really today. We're going to talk a little bit about more of the Nintendo of today in a little bit. But I thought first it might be interesting to talk, maybe the industry at large and sort of maybe some of the things that are happening within the video games industry at large. So I think it's probably at this point that, as we're talking about video games and the industry, you're probably thinking about Nintendo. Obviously, we're going through this podcast. You might be thinking about PlayStation and Xbox, but apparently the video games industry is actually much larger than these three companies. So Hunter, what device do you think most people play video games on today?
I would say a personal computer, maybe.
Not quite, but I like where your head's at.
Okay.
Apparently the thing that most people play video games on today, far and away, is a smartphone.
Oh, I should have guessed that.
Yeah. So I had there's a handy little pie chart out there that sort of shows the breakdown, in terms of global. I guess maybe like I can remember exactly what the figure was, but global usage for playing video games, and about 55% of the market is within the mobile sort of game space. About 20% is the personal computer, right? So your Windows, your Macintoshes, and then the last 25% is sort of split between Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox, respectively. Maybe there's some other smaller players here and there. So Nintendo as a company, as a video game company, very profitable, very pronounced within the industry, creates their own devices, but is ultimately a pretty relatively small slice of the video game industry pie. In fact, this is, we see a lot of, the most popular video games today, something like Candy Crush, which is a app, and we see within their revenues, they're raking in, hundreds of millions and billions of dollars every single year, just on sort of a very simple sort of touch matching color game. So that's kind of where most of the money is today.
Yeah, so it's not with the super sophisticated storytelling games necessarily. It's with the stuff that you can play when you take your phone in your pocket and you have a few minutes to play or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, and we see this across a lot of things, right? TikTok and YouTube, for example, make far more money than the Hollywood studios do off their blockbuster films. And that's just by nature of, one, the scale of things that are being created, and two, sort of the amount of things that can be created and released on a smartphone versus a Nintendo, which has to go through some sort of formal approval device, and just the systems that go into place with that. So, but that said, since we're talking about Nintendo, it is probably worth highlighting their two biggest, video game competitors a little bit, right? So that would be Sony and Microsoft, because they kind of exist inside that 25% pie slice of the market. And so they all sort of directly compete with each other. And so Sony, of course, they make the PlayStation, which today would be the PlayStation 5. And Microsoft makes the Xbox, which today is called the Xbox Series X, which I think is a horrendous name, personally. I think it's just very confusing.
It's not, that doesn't mean Series 10, it's just Series X.
Just Series X from what I can tell. Yeah, because they have a version of it called the Series S as well. It's like a smaller, cheaper version of it. So I'm guessing it's Series X, but who knows? The video game console market today is really broken out into these three companies. So occasionally there comes a sort of a minor player, but they don't ever seem to last very long. There was one company that came out a little while ago called the Ouya, which kind of came around at the time that smartphones were becoming a thing. So I think this device tried to leverage the Android operating system to create a sort of fourth competitor to the market, but it ultimately ended up failing. I think maybe they were a little bit ahead of their time. I don't think the mobile game market at the time was as robust as it is today. Maybe if something like that released today, it'd be popular. I don't know. Sony and PlayStation would appear to be the dominant player in terms of the video game console sales. Its PlayStation 5 is outselling the Nintendo Switch and the Xbox Series X at the moment. So I think, again, even if you're not a video game person, I think broadly you've heard of the PlayStation. It's a very popular, range of Sony devices that play, some of the most sophisticated video games out there today. That said, Nintendo is also in the midst of a transition from a video game company to really more of a media empire in a way that I don't think either Sony or Microsoft can. And that's not to say, obviously Sony is a media company as well. They own Columbia Pictures, so they have a lot of film and music properties that they are attached to them. But Nintendo is becoming more of a media empire in the same way as, we alluded to this earlier, as same way as Disney is, which has very iconic characters, is really riding on the backs of its IP rather than, maybe one-off hits, maybe a couple video games here, a big movie there, that kind of thing.
So the one thing you said, the characters seem to be pretty central to this. So if you go back and, the invention of Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, those seem to have had a lot of staying power. And that seems to be one of the strengths of Nintendo over some of these other companies, that they have these characters that still resonate with people who like to play games.
Yeah,
and there was people who don't as well.
Yeah, there was a global poll, and I have it here in my notes. Global survey conducted that actually showed that Mario edged Disney in terms of, or Mickey Mouse, I should say, in terms of character brand recognition.
Wow.
So, and this was of kids. There's a global poll of kids. So Nintendo's IP, Mario, Zelda, what have you, I think is the singular thing that has buoyed them during some of their rougher years and ensured that they have longevity to them that a lot of companies didn't, right? Atari didn't really have any intellectual property that had these iconic characters that have since grown into weave tales and stories that are really fundamental to a lot of people's childhoods, even into their adulthoods. And I think that's is something that neither Sony or Microsoft have as well. Obviously, they both have monster properties attached to them. I think, Sony has Spider-Man, although it's also a Marvel property. I'm not sure how that works, but they make Spider-Man movies and video games. So that's a huge property for them. Microsoft, I think, owns something called Halo, which is also a pretty monster video game property. But again, I don't think either of these are as iconic in the same way as sort of Mario is or Zelda, which are sort of, I think they tap into maybe sort of that childlike delight a little bit more. So now let's kind of like talk a little bit about Nintendo today. I sort of talked about this earlier, that Nintendo was having a monster year, and that's kind of why, I wanted to talk about them on this podcast. And we're now at the point where we can sort of talk about that, right? So in recent years, Nintendo has really reached a level of success that it hasn't felt in a long time. They did have a pretty successful run in the 2000s with the Nintendo Wii system, and they also had a handheld console called the Nintendo DS that was doing really well. But it does feel like it's on another level at this point. So generally, their business has always been fine. I don't see anything that actually suggests that Nintendo almost went out of business. It's definitely had its ups and downs. There's definitely been periods of time when it just wasn't making as much money as it used to. That said, I don't think they almost went bankrupt in the same way that Atari did. I do know that when the PlayStation was first released, for example, Nintendo's market share took a pretty huge hit. So the PlayStation was a pretty massive release, a console release. So that said, the company's Nintendo Switch console today is its highest selling one yet, with, as of March 31st this year, has sold over 125 million units. So
wow,
it's a lot, right? That's a lot of units. Now, of course, if we compare this to smartphones, this is a drop in the bucket. If Apple sold 125 million, iPhones of whatever its newest iPhone would be, I'm pretty sure that would be a pretty bad release for the iPhone. So it's different context, but obviously a video game device is not seen as integral in the same way as a phone would be. So also a different scale here. To this day, Nintendo still breaks out their sales within 4 major regions. So we're still looking at Japan as one of their major regions, North America, which would be inclusive of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but does not include Central America or the Caribbean. Europe, broadly, I don't know which countries are included and which are not. And then, quote unquote, the rest of the world. And so, again, if we go back to sort of how they originally started releasing their video games, sort of which countries were getting them, they've sort of stuck with this same system. Nintendo's biggest market share to this day is still North America, probably the United States, specifically based on what I can see. Although I can't track exactly Canada's sales figures, but I imagine that that's probably maintained. Followed by Europe, then Japan, and then finally the rest of the world category. Although it's worth pointing out that the rest of the world category is growing. So based on some facts and figures I could find around the internet, it appears that Nintendo is selling directly within China now, something that it hasn't done until pretty recently, where it has somewhere around 4 million Nintendo Switch devices have been sold. So historically, I think China has been pretty closed off to Japanese business interests. So I think that's starting to change, maybe a little bit of a thawing there. But outside of video games, Nintendo is quickly becoming something a bit grander, right? We've talked a lot about this, right? We mentioned earlier that Nintendo is now in the theme park industry and the movie industry. The Super Mario Brothers movie is currently 2023's top movie with about $1.28 billion in box office sales, of which the majority, $717 million, came from outside the United States. So US is still the biggest market, but there's a global demand for this intellectual property, which, by the way, had some pretty impressive Hollywood names attached to it. Chris Pratt, I think, plays Mario. I think Jack Black's in it. Really massive A-list actors.
Yeah, if you want to make a lot of money on a movie, you might try to hire Chris Pratt to be,
he seems to be a big one these days, yeah. Right? We don't have specific numbers for different countries, but I think, it just goes to show that Mario exists as an IP outside of just video games at this point. So just to put this in perspective, Marvel movies have historically, over the last 10 years, been very dominant in the box office. 2 have been released so far this year. Super Mario has earned more than either of those movies. In fact, they've earned more than both combined, as at the last time I looked. It's also released. It's also done better than the new Fast and Furious movie, which is also. Both of these franchises have historically been very strong. In fact, Marvel movies and Fast and Furious movies have historically been what would be considered billion-dollar franchises. So when a new movie comes out and they hit the billion-dollar mark, Super Mario has done better than both of those. They've also performed a lot better than recent Pixar movies. A sequel to Mario is already in the works, and there are now discussions to turn Nintendo's other IP into movies such as Donkey Kong and Zelda. So these would be their other 2 big markets. I know there's also been some rumors floating around some of their lesser known properties. I think at this point, it's probably going to be an IP rush from other companies looking to partner with Nintendo. That said, Nintendo is very, very guarded with their IP. They do not work with anybody. They maintain strict control over it. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in our bonus episode for this week.
Although I will say that just to tie into the Lego episode, that there's been a collaboration with Lego in 2020. They came out with a whole line of sets that interact with one another based on Mario. And then Donkey Kong was just released as a character in Lego this year. Although I did hear rumors that might be coming to a close. But in any case, it goes to show, these super brands sometimes have collaborations and do really well.
Yeah, and I think going back to the Lego set, again, we talked about this in the Lego episode, but there was a set that was literally a TV and a Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yeah, it was the NES, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool system. They had some interactivity towards it.
They've just released, there's an Atari one as well, but they've just released a buildable Pac-Man like mini arcade
Very
game
cool.
as well. It's just about to be released. So there is a hunger among, I think they're probably targeting, Gen X and maybe millennials to a certain degree, who finally have the money to spend on all this stuff and like they didn't when they were kids. So yeah, I'm part of that target market, I think.
Yeah. And so I guess in many ways, this is sort of what, we've talked a little bit about, but Nintendo is really more, I think, in competition these days with Disney than with Sony or Microsoft in terms of sort of what their market is and where they're going, right? So obviously they're still competing with Sony and Microsoft in the video game console market. I don't think that's ever really going to go away. But Nintendo, their IP is really strong. In fact, we talked a little bit about the global survey that was conducted in the 90s and how powerful the Mario brand was. And I think the new movie probably has some executives at Disney, probably pretty worried about sort of maybe the appeal of some of their characters versus some of the appeal of sort of the Nintendo's characters, which are already able to ride such a high wave based on their video games, right? And so, and there's actually one other franchise that Nintendo owns, and I'm going to ask this question, Hunter. What would you say is the highest grossing media franchise in the world?
I mean, I guess I would guess Disney, I suppose, but I have a feeling that's not correct.
That's not correct. In fact, by a long margin, a wide margin, the highest grossing media franchise in the world is Pokemon.
I see. I would not have guessed that. Yeah.
It's apparently. So Nintendo, if you're not familiar, listener, owns Pokemon. And so this is a series of, I think they have animes, they have the video games, they have, all manner of toys. Apparently it is just a monster media franchise. It is something that globally is much stronger than I think maybe you would expect. Maybe it's stronger globally than it is in the United States. I know it's also very popular in the United States. But the second one would be Disney, Disney's Mickey Mouse franchise. So that would also be very dominant, and sort of the list kind of goes down from there. Mario is also on that list as a very dominant franchise. But I just think that people don't really understand how incredibly big Pokemon is. And I think that sort of stands out when you look at sort of the revenues being generated from that. And so I think what we'll do is we'll close out maybe talking a little bit about what's next for Nintendo. So they're still a video game company, and so they'll likely release a new video game console soon. would be my guess. Their last one was released in 2017. So at this point, it's going on 6 years old. From what I could tell, it looks like Nintendo and their competitors release a new console iteration every 5 to 6, 7, 8 years. So this likely will mean that there's more Mario, Zelda, and other branded Nintendo games coming in the future. I don't see any sort of fundamental shift in that regard. So if you're a fan of Mario and Zelda, I know Zelda just recently came out and is really doing well. You're probably safe to assume that another one will be coming at you in the nearish future, in the next few years. But I also think there's a discussion to be had from, with where Nintendo goes from here. Sort of what is their trajectory as a video game company turning into a media empire, and sort of what does that mean for them? And I certainly don't know specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised to see more Nintendo movies come out, more tie-ins with various other properties, and really just trying to not just create sort of one-off movies. I think, there's probably going to be some effort to tie a lot of these things into maybe a broader sort of living world, because that seems to be where a lot of companies are going these days. And so with that, we are probably going to finish up the episode. I do want to quickly hint at sort of the bonus episode for this week, which is, and I have this fun question that I sort of pulled together, which is, how does a Japanese video game company, Nintendo, partner with a Dutch electronics manufacturer to create some of the worst video games ever made that's also based on one of their most popular intellectual properties in the entire world, and then as a result also create one of their largest competitors? So
definitely tune into that one.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun story. We're going to talk a little bit about it. You can listen to it on Friday. But for now, Hunter, let's run through some pluggables.
Thanks. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored with David Manis. And I am co-host of the Geography is Everything podcast, which you are currently listening to.
Yeah, and my name is Jeff Gibson. I am also the co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me on YouTube. That's at youtube.com/little Geography by Jeff. You're welcome to listen to see some of my videos there. They're really fun to make. If you want to follow Hunter and I around a little more closely, please join us over on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com. You can listen to this podcast there if you want. You can listen to the bonus episodes there. You can also read some articles there. You can interact with us a little bit more there. We really like it. And then finally, if you like what you just heard, you like sort of our style, you like sort of what we cover, and you're listening on an app that allows you to rate and review us, such as Apple Podcasts, please do. It really helps us. We really appreciate seeing those come in. And it gives us, a little bit of a boost every now and then. So with that, again, come back Friday for an extra special mini bonus episode that sort of dives into one of Nintendo's more interesting business partnerships.
Thank you for listening.